New York City bans large sugary drinks in restaurants, theaters and streetcars. Should there be more government regulation of the country's powerful food industry? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihan Britansi. The United States is infamous for its food and drink portion sizes. Movie theaters offer beverages in sizes as large as 1.5 litres. But now New York has become the first city to approve a ban on the sale of supersized sugary drinks. Mayor Michael Bloomberg says the ban is an attempt to tackle New York's soaring obesity rate. More than half of New Yorkers are either obese or overweight. The city's health authority estimates 5,000 people die every year from obesity-related health problems. However, the measure has been fiercely criticized by the US soft drink industry, which spent more than $1 million in an advertising campaign against the move. It argues the law restricts consumer freedom. And the issue points to a wider debate about food safety and regulation. The powerful food lobby, made up of more than 50 food and beverage groups, has spent more than $175 million lobbying since President Barack Obama took office in 2009. One of its principal targets is to prevent a California law coming into force that would force labeling on products made with genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. That's despite concerns over the safety of GMO products. On Tuesday, a new report is expected to paint a bleak picture of obesity rates in the United States. Earlier, I spoke to John Banshoff, a public interest lawyer who in recent years has been focusing on the food industry's role in the nation's obesity. I asked him why he believes using the law is the correct strategy for combating public health problems.
Well, a very simple answer is all the conventional remedies aren't working. Education isn't working. It's very similar to what we had in the 1960s with regard to smoking, where everybody said all we can do is try to educate people. We proved that wrong by getting anti-smoking messages on the air, cigarette commercials off the air, banning cigarette billboards, killing off Joe Camel, higher taxes on cigarettes, higher health insurance premiums for smokers. We have cut smoking by about 50%. The same kind of hard-hitting tactics, imposing personal responsibility, can, I think, do exactly the same thing as for obesity. The only problem is many foundations in the government don't have the guts to promote it.
Well, this comparison with big tobacco is quite interesting. Isn't there a difference, though? With tobacco, there's a clear link to cancer and consumption, whereas in the fight against some of these food manufacturers and big agribusiness and so forth, isn't it a bit more difficult to definitively link them to one person's obesity?
Well, certainly there are differences between big tobacco and big food, but there are also many similarities. I don't think there's any doubt, we have very, very good data, for example, that sugary soft drinks are a major cause of obesity. They are certainly the easily most preventable cause which we can do something about. But we know what foods are fattening. We can tax them. We can require, as we are under Obamacare, calorie disclosure, but we can also require a more meaningful disclosure, for example, using 1 to 5 stars or smiley faces, or my favorite, which is a red light for foods which have too many calories for the nutritional value. These are all things we can do, and they work, and there's no reason to suspect we'll be any less successful with regard to obesity than we were with regard to tobacco.
Shouldn't this be the role, though, of regulatory agencies, the US Food and Drug Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture, and so forth? Why is there a need to take the legal route in all this?
I think all you have to do is look back at what the federal government has done about smoking, which is zip, nothing. It was my legal actions and the legal actions of my colleagues that got anti-smoking messages on the air, cigarette commercials off the air. We killed off Joe Camel. We killed off cigarette billboards. We imposed a $250 billion penalty on the tobacco industry. These are all growing out of lawsuits and regulatory actions that my colleagues and I bring. We litigate until the legislators begin to legislate.
How would you describe the relationship between big agriculture and food corporations and the regulatory structures that are currently in place?
Unfortunately, they are all too incestuous. Very frequently, the general counsel of a major government agency will come from the industry, will go back to the industry. All too often our agencies and also our foundations are more interested in getting the cooperation, cuddling up, for example, with the manufacturers of soft drinks, rather than simply imposing restrictions on them, saying, no, you can't sell sugary soft drinks, what we call liquid candy, in schools. No, there's going to be a tax on them. That's the kind of thing we have to do. Unfortunately, the industry has too much input, too much lobbying influence in Congress and before the agencies.
So will further regulation help improve our eating habits? With me to discuss this from Austin, Texas, is Tom Philpott, the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones magazine. Per Pinstrup-Andersen, professor of food, nutrition and public policy at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He's also the former president of the American Agricultural Economics Association. And here in the studio, Adam Eidinger, spokesman for the Occupy Monsanto movement, a group campaigning for labeling of food products containing GMO. In fact, I believe it's Occupy Monsanto Week as we speak now, at least it's just beginning. Professor Pinstrup-Andersen, first of all, what do you make of initiatives such as Mayor Bloomberg's? Are they likely to be effective? Is it overly paternalistic? Is it unenforceable? Does this make sense?
I think it's a great initiative. We don't really know if it's going to be effective or not, but it's worth a try. We need to do everything we can to stop the growth in obesity and chronic diseases in the United States, and for that matter in many other countries as well. And if it takes regulation, that's what we're going to need. If it takes cutting out some large bottles of Coke or whatever it is, sugary drinks, that's what it takes. I think we can come part way with increasing awareness, education, but I agree that that would only take us part way. We're going to need to do something. Right now, 1/3 of the US population is overweight but not obese. Another third is obese, and the last third may become obese if we don't do something.
But clearly, Tom Philpott, the arguments are raised, well, where's this all going to end? I mean, regulating how many calories we can actually consume in one meal and a sitting in a restaurant and so forth, and the questions of freedom of choice and so forth. What do you make of those arguments?
Well, I think it's worth a try to do this.
Tom Philpott, yes.
And I think perhaps a better angle would be to actually tax sugar in sodas. And I think that to do that in a fair way, I think what you would want to do is tax sugar and then take the proceeds and invest them in expanding access to healthy foods in low-income areas. I do think that you are risking kind of nanny state charges by specifically saying that you can't buy this kind of soft drink. But I do think it's a worthy start to this experiment to figure out how to get people to eat a little bit less sugar, because the science that's developing around this question is becoming overwhelming, that sort of added sugars and other sweeteners in food is contributing heavily to this health crisis.
But I mean, Adam, do you think that sugar should be compared to alcohol and tobacco for its addictive qualities and the health implications, social implications of consumption, or is that taking it too far, do you think?
No, it's not taking it too far. I mean, it is addictive. Sugar is very addictive, and you can tell who's addicted to it. I also, think the solution is not Diet Coke either, or eating some sort of synthetic food product, which the company that we're protesting, Monsanto, pioneered aspartame, for instance. I think we need to be careful, though, about what we're eating, maybe think about what we're eating, and to discourage huge quantities of these sugary sodas is perfectly reasonable. But people will still be able to drink as much as they want to drink, and you might have to buy a second cup.
I mean, talking about the emerging science, I mean, we've read a lot about sugar's contribution to obesity, but now we have a recent series of studies suggesting sugar intake is linked to Alzheimer's disease. Scientists believe that Alzheimer's is largely caused by the brain becoming resistant to insulin, and recent research suggests excess sugar consumption leads to insulin resistance as well as its other functions. Insulin regulates the neurotransmitters crucial for memory and learning. It's also important for the function and growth of blood vessels which supply the brain with oxygen and glucose. Professor Pinstrup-Andersen, as we're presented with more and more evidence of how bad sugar is for us, though, why is it up to rogue mayors like Michael Bloomberg then to actually make the running on issues like this? I mean, should the government, should federal regulators be getting more involved?
Well, in fact, the World Health Organization some years ago introduced a report basically cutting back on the amount of added sugar in the diet. The US government didn't particularly support that recommendation. It is extremely difficult because some sugar doesn't do any harm. Too much sugar, too much sweetener, high fructose corn syrup. If we have too much of it, we end up being overweight, obese, and possibly suffering from other illnesses as well. So the problem is how do we maintain a balance? How do we protect ourselves from intaking too much refined sugar and too much fat? It is extremely difficult to deal with.
And once again, Tom Philpott, though, this is where this issue of the lobbying underway comes in, the power of the American Beverage Association in this case, the fact that they've been able to incorporate themselves into the public school system so effectively, with public schools effectively giving pouring rights to either Coke or Pepsi in their schools and so forth. I mean, is this completely unchecked? I mean, what's going on with all this?
Well, I mean, I think the basic problem here is that the status quo as we have it is working very, very well for these companies. And as you pointed out a little while ago, the regulatory agencies are very, very close to these industries, and it is going to be extremely hard to change that. And a perfect example is the fact that, some huge portion of school districts in this country literally have a contract with Pepsi or Coke to handle all of the beverages in the cafeteria. And I think that, it's very true that I think, the obvious solution from these companies' perspective is, let us serve diet drinks in schools. And I think that the Occupy Monsanto fellow was exactly right that diet drinks aren't the answer either. There's evidence that they are linked to obesity and overweight and diabetes and things like that. So I think that the fundamental problem here is how do we get an independent regulatory sort of system in the United States, because we certainly don't have it right now.
Right, so I suppose, is this underlying, let's widen this out then a bit to Occupy Monsanto and the campaign that you're currently involved with, Adam. Is that what's underlying the suspicion of genetically modified food then, that we aren't getting all the information, that the regulatory structure isn't in place for organisms in our food supply which are basically prevalent in our food supply then?
Well, this is lab food. These are genes that are developed to make it possible to spray these crops with increased amounts of weed killer and pesticide. These residues are found in the environment. They're found in the blood of expecting mothers. We are reducing fertility in this country. If you look at the CDC statistics on fertility for the last 60 years, it's steadily dropping off. Sperm counts are dropping off. We have to look at the chemicals in our environment. I think that's the issue here. Is this is industrial agriculture, and we're talking about Coke and Pepsi. We have to broaden it for sure. Michael Taylor, the head of food safety at the Food and Drug Administration, is the former vice president of public affairs for Monsanto, and he was appointed by the Obama administration. You have Hillary Clinton and the State Department promoting industrial agriculture in Africa. She was a former lawyer at the Rose Law Firm back in the 90s when the GMO policy was formulated. We're the only country that believes that GMOs are both substantially equivalent and at the same time unique enough to patent. And that's a policy that was put in place by the industry. It's a monopoly now, really, what we have. And the government is doing the bidding of this monopoly. It's time to break it up.
How much do we actually know, Tom Philpott, about the safety of genetically modified organisms? How much regulation is there? How much testing is done before the Food and Drug Administration, for example, deregulates, as they term it, a particular GM crop?
Well, the problem here is that we don't know very much at all. In the 90s, actually in the 80s, when the FDA was first looking at these technologies, they made the decision to consider them generally regarded as safe. Basically, as Adam said, substantially equivalent to non-GMO products. And when they did that, that meant, for all time until, including right now, no independent safety testing of these products is required. And as a result, we have very little long-term research on the safety effects of these products. We are sort of undergoing this society-wide experiment in it, but we have very little data on it. And when there has been data, and another problem that must be said is that these companies, when they own the technology rights and the germplasm rights to these crops, they are able to restrict science that gets done on them. You have to apply to Monsanto for the right to grow their seeds in order to test them. And you know, these two factors, no independent testing imposed by the FDA and the sort of control that the industry has over what testing gets done, means that we have a paucity of actual research. And there are isolated indications here and there in tests mainly done in Europe where scientists are a bit more skeptical, that suggest that there might be long-term problems in, you know, there's indications of fertility problems in mice. I want to emphasize here, though, that these are not definitive tests.
Right.
But what we need is more long-term testing before we.
There was a
know
recent
much of
report
anything at all.
that was published called GMO Myths and Truths. It was co-authored, in fact, by genetic engineers. It was released in June. Amongst the key findings then, genetic manipulation, it says, has not been proven safe over the long term. And I think it's sort of collated a number of peer-reviewed studies in order to show what is out there. This is what they found. Genetically modified seeds can produce toxins or allergens in the food itself. Animal feeding trials have shown disturbances in liver and kidney function and in immune responses. Most GM crops are engineered to incorporate either herbicides or pesticides into a plant's DNA. But one heavily used pesticide, Monsanto's Roundup, was found to cause birth defects, reproductive and neurological problems, cancer, and even damage to DNA itself. Professor Pinstrup-Andersen, faced with that uncertainty, admittedly, we don't have the definitive long-term studies yet. Shouldn't there be more caution, regulation, and indeed labeling of these products in the US?
First of all, I don't believe that labeling is going to make any difference in the United States, because almost everything we consume is associated in one way or the other with genetic engineering. So the only thing we can do, if, for example, Proposition 37 passes in California, the only thing that corporations can do is to label everything to the effect that it may contain genetic engineering. So the only food that would not be labeled as such would be what's produced on certified organic farms. So I'm not sure we would gain much by that kind of a labeling. Over the long term, you might see a branch of the American food system that would develop into producing food that clearly does not contain genetic engineering, and that food would then compete with the certified organic food, but that's a longer term perspective. Regarding the evidence that you mentioned, as far as I know, and I've been following this for the last 20 years and written about it extensively, none of the evidence that you mentioned has been exposed to scientific rigor. None of that's been published in refereed journals. So the evidence is really not there. I agree that much more research is needed. We always need more research, but I don't think we should stop using genetic engineering at this point while we're waiting for more research. Everything that's available commercially, as far as I can tell, is safe. Not a single person has suffered health problems because of the consumption of genetically modified food, which doesn't mean that we couldn't have a food in the future that would be toxin or that would cause allergens or cause problems. So we need to continue, obviously, to regulate. We need to test. We need to approve. That has to continue. But so far, I believe we've been either lucky or very efficient in approval of what's available.
Adam Eidinger.
Okay, so I just want to respond to one thing. Labeling is crucial because that puts the consumer in the driver's seat. If the consumer can choose between a product that might be $2 and is containing genetically modified organisms and a product that's $2.50 that does not contain genetically modified organisms, they may be willing to move to the non-GMO when they realize, okay, well, this product probably doesn't have as many chemicals in it. This probably doesn't have residue from the pesticides and herbicides or have them expressed in the plant itself. So I think it will shift what the farmers plant over a number of years. It'll probably take a decade to really see the impact. But if you look at Europe, only 20% of the food consumed in Europe, actually food produced in Europe, to correct myself, is actually GMO. And in here, we're looking at 80 to 90% in the United States. So when the consumer's in the driver's seat, when they know what they're buying, they tend to avoid it.
All right, but what are the issues? What about the issue of there not having been scientifically rigorous studies, peer-reviewed studies, to show that there is a health problem?
Well, I think that there needs to be more studies, of course. I think I'm not against research. I'm for putting these crops back in the laboratory and then doing the proper research and then releasing them. I think also there are conventional and organic alternatives to all of these crops, and the real motivation here is to get that patent, to be able to say we own this germplasm, this is our seed, this is our genes, and Monsanto has for over a decade intimidated farmers that if you don't grow our crops, we're going to come on your farm, we're going to prove that you have seeds that have our DNA, and we're going to sue you.
Tom Philpott, a lot of claims are made for GMO seeds and foods. Have they been borne out, whether it be on yield or water usage, food security for farmers, and so forth?
Not so much. There was a comprehensive study by a man named Doug Gurian-Sherman of the Union of Concerned Scientists on the question of yield. And you know, yield is one of the sort of things that are hauled out to defend GMO crops, that we need to grow them because they will increase yields, and if we don't, then you know, by 2050 we're going to have mass starvation. And what Gurian-Sherman found is that, you know, so GMOs were commercialized in '96 and very quickly took over U.S. corn and soy fields, also cotton, and now we're getting into a couple more crops. And you know, in that 15 or 16 years or so of commercialization, they've increased yields barely at all. Most of the yield gains over that time period have actually come from conventional breeding, not from the GM trait inserted into the crop. And in terms of more complex, what we call complex traits, like drought resistance, like nitrogen use efficiency, that people are hoping for in the next 15 or 20 years, Gurian-Sherman has also found that that good old conventional breeding, and you know, even seeds in places like Mexico, which is where corn was domesticated in the first place, they've got landrace varieties of corn in Mexico that are extremely drought tolerant, for the simple fact that they've been grown in places that are low water for a long time. And you know, with insights like that, we could actually, with conventional breeding, a lot more cheaply figure out solutions to problems like drought tolerance. So I think that, you know, in the 15 years that we've seen them in the field, the problems that they've mainly solved is sort of, I'll put it bluntly, how do you sell more herbicides?
Right.
Herbicide use since the advent of Roundup Ready technology has exploded. Massive amounts of herbicides have come onto farm fields. And not just Roundup. Roundup is considered to be a relatively benign herbicide. That reputation is slipping a little bit, but as it loses effectiveness, as weeds gain resistance to it, we're seeing older and more toxic herbicides come out.
So, Professor, I mean, surely faced with those concerns about the motivation of agribusiness, the lack of transparency in being able to carry out scientific studies on GMO seeds and pesticides, the lack of a regulatory structure or an effective regulatory structure, the revolving door between business and the regulatory structures, surely we should be erring on the side of caution then, shouldn't we?
No, but I completely agree. We need more independent research. I think we can always use more research. But let me make a couple of points on what has been said so far. One of the main benefits of genetic engineering in food and agriculture has been that we've been able to cut back on the use of chemicals to protect the crops from insects by building the insect resistance into the crops. Let me share with you what I'm really concerned about. I'm not too emotionally involved as to whether we're going to have labeling of GMO food in the United States or not. I am very concerned that what we do in this country is going to reflect the decisions made in developing countries where they need all of the scientific approaches to deal with drought tolerance.
But even if they haven't been tested for long-term health effects, and indeed they might actually lessen food sovereignty for farmers because the seeds are patented and they can't store them for the following season and so forth. Should we just have complete faith in Monsanto?
Well, but this is really not an issue. This argument is at least 20 years old, because most of the research done in developing countries using genetic engineering is done by the public sector, and what they produce is freely available to farmers.
Very quickly, Adam Eidinger, your response in about 20 seconds.
Okay, so the Hillary Clinton is promoting GMOs in Africa right now. Monsanto is in a partnership with the State Department, so they're clearly promoting these patented seeds in Africa, and they want to sell farm equipment too. So this is about promoting U.S. economic interests, not about healthy food.
All right, we'll leave it there. Adam Eidinger, thank you very much. Professor Andersen, thank you. Tom Philpott, thank you very much too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the programme. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.